United States, 1972. Part 1. A City in Crisis. New York City in 1972 was a city under siege, not by invaders, but by an invisible force of despair. The once bustling streets were now filled with the homeless and jobless, the forgotten and the hopeless. Factories had closed, crime had risen, and a shadow of fear hung over the neighborhoods like a heavy fog. The city, so proud of its towering skyline and cultural vibrance, was crumbling under the weight of a financial crisis that seemed insurmountable. Buildings decayed, and businesses shuttered their doors as desperation became the new norm. Amid this chaos stood St. Mary's Hospital, a small Catholic institution tucked into the poorer side of the city. It wasn't the grandest of hospitals, nor the most advanced, but for decades, it had been a refuge for the city's poorest souls, those who had nowhere else to turn. The hospital's halls, once bustling with staff and hopeful families, now echoed with the silence of uncertainty. Doctors, nurses, and patients all knew that St. Mary's was on the brink of closure. The funding had dried up, and so had the donations that once kept it afloat. The hospital's fate seemed sealed. Yet in the middle of this looming disaster, there was a woman whose faith had never wavered, Grace O'Connor. Grace was no stranger to hardship. At 37, she had spent nearly 2 decades of her life walking these very halls, watching lives come into the world and seeing them depart. Her auburn hair was often tied back in a neat bun, her face lined with the signs of too many sleepless nights spent caring for others. Her uniform was always crisp, despite the frayed edges, a testament to her unwavering dedication. Though the hospital was falling apart, Grace moved through it with the grace and purpose of someone on a mission. This hospital wasn't just her job, it was her life. For Grace, St. Mary's wasn't just a building. It was a place of healing, not just for the body, but for the soul. Every patient that walked through the door, regardless of their background, received her full attention and compassion. And yet, the weight of the hospital's impending closure pressed down on her heart like a vice. Each day brought more news of layoffs, more rumors of bankruptcy, and more fear that the doors would soon close forever. Grace felt the burden of this knowledge in every step she took, every breath she drew. One cold autumn evening, after another grueling day of caring for the sick and injured with dwindling supplies, Grace found herself alone in the hospital's tiny chapel. It was a modest room, no larger than a storage closet, with a few wooden pews, a small altar, and a single stained glass window that cast dim, colorful light onto the worn stone floor. The scent of melted wax from the few lit candles hung in the air, mingling with the dust that seemed to settle in every corner of the old building. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The weight of the hospital's troubles bore down on her, and for the first time in her life, she felt utterly helpless. The words of her prayer were whispered, broken with the sobs she could no longer hold back. "Lord, what can I do? We have nothing left. The hospital is failing, and these people need us. I need you." Her voice cracked under the strain, and tears began to fall, soaking the hem of her skirt as she knelt in the silence of the empty chapel. Her faith, which had always been the rock she leaned on, now felt distant, as if even God himself had turned away from the plight of St. Mary's. But in the quiet of that moment, something stirred within her, a sense of peace that she couldn't quite explain. The air in the room seemed to shift, and for the briefest moment, Grace felt as though she wasn't alone. But there was no voice, no clear answer, just the gentle whisper of hope in her heart. She rose from the chapel and made her way home, the cold wind of the city biting at her cheeks as she walked through the narrow streets to her small apartment. Grace shared the modest 2-bedroom space with her elderly mother, Margaret O'Connor, who had raised her on the values of faith, compassion, and perseverance. Margaret's health had been declining, and each day was a reminder to Grace of the fragility of life. When she arrived home, Margaret was already asleep, her frail form curled beneath a blanket. Grace kissed her mother's forehead and prepared for bed, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. But that night, Grace's sleep was far from restful. In the early hours of the morning, as the city outside slept beneath the glow of distant streetlights, Grace had a dream. It was unlike any dream she had ever had. She found herself standing in the courtyard of St. Mary's Hospital, but the air around her was thick with warmth and light, and a strange calm had settled over the usually chaotic surroundings. Everything was brighter, more vivid than real life. The buildings, the trees, even the sky seemed to radiate a glow that wasn't of this world. And then, before her, a figure appeared, a figure that she immediately recognized, though she had never seen him before in her waking life. It was Jesus Christ. His presence was overwhelming, yet filled with an indescribable peace. His robes were simple, glowing with a soft, golden light, and his eyes, deep and kind, met hers with a gaze that seemed to pierce through every doubt, every fear she had ever held. He reached out to her, his hands scarred from the nails of the cross, but they were hands of healing, not of suffering. "Grace," he spoke, his voice soft yet powerful, "build me a chapel within these walls." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ask how, to say that there was no money, no resources, that the hospital was crumbling. But before she could speak, Jesus continued, "It will be a place of healing, where faith will restore what medicine cannot. You have been chosen to build it." And with that, the vision faded, the light dimmed, and Grace awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just a dream. It was a calling. The next morning, Grace could hardly contain the urgency she felt as she rushed to the hospital. The cold, gray light of dawn had barely broken over the city when she arrived, her mind racing with the vision she had seen. She needed to share it, to tell someone. She needed help. Grace found Dr. Michael Hernandez in the break room, nursing a cup of stale coffee. Dr. Hernandez was one of the few remaining doctors at St. Mary's. His once jet black hair had turned silver over the years, and his face bore the lines of someone who had seen far too much suffering. He had been born and raised in Puerto Rico before coming to New York to practice medicine, and he had served St. Mary's with as much dedication as Grace had. But even he was starting to lose hope. "Michael," Grace said, her voice breathless with excitement, "I had a dream last night. No, not a dream, a vision. Jesus came to me. He told me to build a chapel in the hospital, a place of healing." Dr. Hernandez looked up from his coffee, his brow furrowed. "Grace, you know we don't have the resources for that. We can barely keep the lights on, let alone build a chapel." But Grace shook her head, her heart racing. "I don't care about the money. We have to try. This was real, Michael. I've never felt anything like it before. He told me that faith will heal what medicine can't." Dr. Hernandez sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had always respected Grace, admired her faith and her compassion. But this sounded impossible. "You're asking us to build something out of nothing." "I'm not asking you to believe in the resources," Grace said softly. "I'm asking you to believe in the vision." It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Grace, fueled by the divine message she had received, set her mind on the task ahead. Despite the doubts surrounding her, despite the crumbling walls and empty coffers of St. Mary's, she would begin the work, alone if she had to. Jesus had spoken, and Grace would answer the call. Part 2. Faith in the Unknown. The basement of St. Mary's Hospital was a world of its own, hidden beneath the bustling city streets above. It was a place most avoided unless absolutely necessary, filled with the smell of dust, mildew, and the faint scent of old medicines that had long since expired. The walls were cracked, the floors uneven, and the light flickered from the overhead bulbs that were in desperate need of replacement. But to Grace, this space was not a dungeon of forgotten things. It was the foundation of a dream, a sacred mission given to her by the Lord himself. The day after her conversation with Dr. Hernandez, Grace found herself standing at the entrance of the basement. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gazed at the dilapidated room before her. She had no blueprint, no architectural training, and no money. Yet, she was certain of one thing. This was where the chapel would rise. Grace took a deep breath, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, and stepped inside. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, and as she walked further into the room, she let her fingers graze the cold, rough stone walls. They felt old, like they had witnessed generations of healing and suffering alike. She closed her eyes for a moment, silently praying, "Lord, guide my hands. Let your will be done here, as you commanded." There was no choir of angels, no divine voice offering step-by-step instructions, but Grace felt a quiet certainty. She knelt in the center of the room, her knees pressed against the cold concrete floor, and began to pray with all her heart. It wasn't long before her prayers were interrupted by a voice from behind. "Grace!" She turned to see Sister Agnes standing at the doorway, her face lined with concern. The nun, dressed in her traditional habit, had been with St. Mary's for over 3 decades, serving the hospital as both a spiritual guide and a caregiver. Though quiet by nature, Sister Agnes was known for her wisdom and deep connection to the faith. "I heard about what you're planning," Sister Agnes said softly as she approached. Her footsteps were slow, and there was a weight to her words, as if she were carrying the same burden of doubt that many at the hospital had. Grace rose to her feet, brushing off the dust from her knees. "I know it sounds impossible, Agnes," she began, "but I had a vision. I have to build this chapel. It's what he wants." Sister Agnes nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the desolation of it all. The cracked walls, the old, rusting equipment pushed into forgotten corners, the faint smell of dampness. "But how?" she asked. "With what?" Grace's lips tightened into a determined line. "With faith, in whatever I can find." For a moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch into eternity. The only sound was the distant hum of the hospital's generators and the faint creaking of the buildings settling around them. Then, with a soft sigh, Sister Agnes reached into her habit and pulled out a small, worn crucifix, its wooden surface faded from years of handling. She held it out to Grace. "If you believe this is his will, then start with this." Grace took the crucifix with trembling hands, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Agnes. I won't let you down." From that moment on, Grace threw herself into the work. Her days were spent tending to patients, administering care with her usual tireless compassion. But as soon as her shift ended, she would descend into the basement. The room became her personal sanctuary, a place where her hands could create something tangible out of the vision she had received. She started by clearing the space. Old medical equipment, broken furniture, and forgotten supplies were dragged out into the hall. She worked alone at first, her hands blistering as she moved heavy boxes and scrubbed the grime from the floors. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to fulfilling the purpose Jesus had given her. But the task was monumental. The basement was large, and as the days wore on, the exhaustion began to catch up with her. There were nights when Grace would collapse onto the hard concrete floor in prayer, her body aching, her mind filled with doubts. How could she, a single woman, transform this forgotten corner of the hospital into a place of worship? What if it was all too much? What if she had misunderstood the vision? Yet every time these doubts crept into her mind, she would hear the soft, reassuring voice from her dream. "Build me a chapel, Grace. It will be a place of healing." It was enough to push her forward. One evening, after several weeks of solitary labor, Grace returned to the basement to find someone waiting for her. Dr. Hernandez stood at the entrance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had been watching her for some time, unsure of how to approach the situation. But seeing her determination day after day, something inside him shifted. "I brought these," he said, holding up a few old wooden planks. "They were going to be thrown out. I figured you could use them." Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. I didn't expect." He interrupted her with a wave of his hand. "You didn't expect me to help? Well, I didn't either. But I can't watch you break your back down here alone anymore. Besides, I don't know if I believe in miracles, but I believe in you. Let's see what we can do." With Dr. Hernandez's help, the progress became more noticeable. Together, They began piecing together a rudimentary structure, an altar from discarded wooden crates, benches from old planks. They worked in the evenings after their shifts had ended, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging stories from their long hours at the hospital. Dr. Hernandez, who had once been skeptical, found himself strangely inspired by Grace's unwavering belief. As they worked, more people began to take notice. A few nurses, curious about the rumors of Grace's project, would stop by the basement on their breaks. At first, they came to watch, unsure of what to think. But soon, they too began to lend a hand. Someone brought a bucket of paint to brighten the walls. Another nurse donated an old rug to soften the cold concrete floor. Slowly, piece by piece, the basement was transformed. It wasn't grand or extravagant by any means. There were no marble statues, no ornate stained glass windows. But it was a chapel born of love, faith, and sacrifice. The walls were freshly painted, though the cracks beneath the surface remained. The altar was simple, adorned only by the small crucifix Sister Agnes had given to Grace, but it held a sacred significance that no gold or jewels could replicate. Every night, before leaving, Grace would light a single candle on the altar and kneel in prayer. The soft glow of the flame illuminated the tiny chapel, casting long shadows on the walls. But to Grace, it felt like a beacon in the darkness. She prayed not just for the hospital, but for every person who would one day walk through those basement doors, those seeking healing, hope, or simply a place to feel God's presence. Word of the chapel began to spread through the hospital like a quiet whisper. The janitors, the kitchen staff, even the patients who were well enough to move around heard about the little sanctuary being built in the basement. Some came out of curiosity, others out of need. One evening, as Grace was sweeping the floor of the chapel, a young woman appeared at the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, and she held a small child in her arms, a boy no older than 4. His skin was ashen, his breath labored. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Can I pray here?" Grace nodded, stepping aside to make room for the woman and her child. She watched as the mother knelt at the altar, clutching her son close to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers into the boy's hair. It was in that moment that Grace realized something profound. This chapel, this small room that she had labored over for weeks, wasn't just a building. It was a vessel for faith. It was a place where people could come, not to be healed by the hands of doctors, but by something greater, something that transcended medicine and human understanding. As the mother wept before the cross, Grace knelt beside her and prayed silently. For the first time since the dream, she felt the weight of her purpose fully settle on her shoulders. This was not about saving a hospital. It was about saving souls. The chapel was no longer just a vision. It was becoming a reality. Part 3, a beacon of hope. As the small chapel took shape, something extraordinary began to happen. What had started as a hidden project in the forgotten basement of St. Mary's Hospital slowly became the beating heart of the entire institution. The first rays of hope pierced through the heavy cloud of despair that had once settled over the hospital. It began with whispers, soft and tentative, spreading from one patient to another, from nurse to doctor, from visitor to neighbor. People were talking about the small chapel Grace had built, tucked away in the most unlikely of places. But it wasn't just the story of the chapel that drew their attention. It was what was happening inside. One evening, just days after the young mother had come to pray for her son, the boy's condition began to improve. It was subtle at first. His fever began to drop, his breathing steadied, and color slowly returned to his cheeks. The doctors, initially cautious in their optimism, were soon bewildered by the boy's rapid recovery. His condition had been serious, and by all medical reasoning, he should not have been healing this quickly. Yet he was. When the boy's mother, her faith now bolstered by this miraculous turnaround, shared her story with the other patients, the news spread like wildfire. People began to talk not just about the doctors and nurses, but about the power of prayer within Grace's chapel. The boy's recovery was seen as nothing short of a miracle, and the chapel became a place of pilgrimage for those who had lost hope. It wasn't long before more patients started visiting the chapel, their footsteps echoing softly in the dimly lit basement as they approached the small altar. Some came in wheelchairs. Others walked slowly with the help of canes or their family members. They came with illnesses that medicine had struggled to heal, with hearts heavy from grief or fear. And as they knelt before the simple wooden cross that Grace had placed on the altar, they prayed. Some prayed for themselves, others prayed for their loved ones, but all who came sought the same thing, a miracle. Grace, though humbled by the growing attention, remained focused on her work. Each evening, after her shifts were over, she returned to the chapel. Sometimes she would find people already there, their heads bowed in silent prayer, and she would join them quietly, offering her own prayers for the hospital, for the city, and for all those who sought healing. Other times, she found the chapel empty, and in those quiet moments, she would light a candle and sit before the cross, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. But the miracles did not stop. One afternoon, a man named Samuel Peters, who had been bedridden for months with a degenerative bone disease, asked to be wheeled down to the chapel. His prognosis had been grim, his body weakened by the disease. His doctors had warned his family that there was little hope for recovery. Yet Samuel, a devout man of faith, insisted on visiting the chapel. His wife, Anna, who had spent months by his side, accompanied him as the orderly wheeled his bed into the basement. When they arrived, the chapel was quiet. A single candle flickered on the altar, casting long shadows across the walls, and the air was thick with a sense of the sacred. Samuel, too weak to kneel, clasped his hands together and prayed from his bed. His voice was soft but filled with conviction as he whispered, "Lord, I ask for your mercy. Heal me, if it is your will." Grace, who had been nearby tending to another patient, heard his prayer and quietly joined in, standing a few feet behind him. She didn't speak, but in her heart, she echoed his plea for healing. The moment stretched out, the chapel filled with the quiet sound of prayer, and time seemed to slow. When Samuel returned to his room later that day, something inside him had changed. He couldn't explain it at first. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his body. Over the next few days, his condition began to improve in ways that defied the expectations of his doctors. His pain, which had once been unbearable, lessened. His strength, which had slowly ebbed away over the months, returned. His doctors were baffled by his sudden recovery, but to Samuel and Anna, the answer was clear. "It was the chapel," Samuel told his wife one evening. "God answered my prayers there." And so, Samuel's story became yet another testament to the growing power of the chapel. As the tales of miraculous healings multiplied, so too did the number of visitors. Patients who had once resigned themselves to despair now found themselves filled with a renewed sense of hope. Some, like Samuel, experienced physical healings that left doctors scratching their heads. Others found solace in their prayers, a peace that transcended their physical ailments. Dr. Hernandez, who had once been skeptical, began to take notice as well. He watched as more and more patients requested to visit the chapel, their spirits lifted after even a short time spent in prayer. At first, he had dismissed it as a coincidence, a placebo effect born from desperation. But as the number of stories grew, it became harder to ignore. Even his own patients, those he had deemed beyond medical intervention, began to show signs of recovery after visiting the basement chapel. One day, after an especially difficult surgery, Dr. Hernandez made his way to the chapel himself. He stood at the doorway, hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of someone praying softly at the altar. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, his footsteps slow and measured. As he approached the altar, he felt something shift within him. The weight of the past few months, of watching patients suffer, of trying and failing to save lives, seemed to lift if only for a moment. He knelt at the altar, his hands clasped together, and for the first time in a long while, he prayed. "God," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't know if I believe in miracles, but I believe in hope. If you're here, please let me see it." He stayed there for what felt like hours, the soft glow of the candle the only light in the room. And though no booming voice came from the heavens and no vision appeared before him, Dr. Hernandez felt a calm settle over him. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The chapel had become more than just a physical space. It was a sanctuary for the weary, a place where faith met the unknown, and where hope could flourish even in the darkest of times. The walls, once bare and cold, now seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the prayers of those who had come before lingered in the air, their faith imprinted on the very fabric of the room. As the days passed, more and more people from the community began to visit the chapel. Word had spread beyond the hospital walls into the streets of New York City. Families who had long lost hope began to bring their sick relatives, not for medical treatment, but for the power of prayer. Some came seeking healing, others came seeking peace. But all who entered the chapel felt the presence of something greater than themselves. It wasn't long before the chapel became a place of pilgrimage. People from all walks of life, rich, poor, young, old, came to see the small, humble space where miracles were said to happen. The chapel was not grand or ornate. It didn't need to be. Its power lay in the simplicity of faith, in the quiet moments where prayers were whispered in the shadows, and in the flickering light of the candles that burned day and night. For Grace, watching the chapel become a beacon of hope was both humbling and awe-inspiring. She had started this journey with nothing but a vision, a dream that had seemed impossible. Yet here she was, standing in the midst of a miracle she had never fully understood. The chapel, once just a collection of discarded wood and faith, had become the heart of St. Mary's, a place where the impossible became possible. But with the miracles came questions. Not everyone believed in what was happening in the chapel. Some dismissed the stories as exaggerated tales, the desperate fantasies of people with nowhere else to turn. Others, including some of the hospital's administration, began to grow uneasy with the attention the chapel was drawing. They feared that too much focus on the supernatural would undermine the hospital's reputation as a place of science and medicine. Yet, despite the doubts, the chapel continued to thrive. For every skeptic, there was someone whose life had been touched by the power of prayer. And for Grace, that was enough. The chapel had become more than she ever could have imagined. And as she stood before the altar one evening, watching the soft glow of the candlelight dance across the walls, she knew that this was only the beginning. Part 4. The Struggle of Doubt. The quiet hum of the hospital's daily operations drifted through the walls, muffled by the heavy wooden door of the boardroom. Inside, the atmosphere was far more tense. The long, rectangular table was filled with members of St. Mary's Hospital's administration, their faces etched with concern. Papers and reports were scattered across the polished surface, but no one was paying attention to the numbers in front of them. All eyes were on Grace, who stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped in front of her as she faced the skepticism of the room. Grace had been summoned to this meeting earlier that morning, though the reason had been vague. Still, she had a sense of what this was about. The chapel had grown in notoriety, and with that attention came whispers, questions, and doubts, not just from the outside, but from within the hospital itself. The board, composed mostly of business-minded individuals who oversaw the hospital's financial viability, was growing increasingly uneasy about the impact the chapel was having on the institution's reputation. Across from her sat Mr. Robert Whitman, the hospital's chief financial officer, a tall man with thinning gray hair and a stern expression. He adjusted his glasses as he spoke, his tone measured but sharp. "Grace, we've been hearing a lot of things about this chapel you've built in the basement," he began, flipping through the papers in front of him. "While we understand the importance of faith in a hospital like ours, there are concerns about the direction things are taking." Grace met his gaze, her heart steady but her pulse quickening. She had expected resistance, but the weight of their scrutiny was heavier than she'd anticipated. She remained silent, letting him finish. "Miracles," Whitman said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "People are saying there have been miraculous healings, that patients are getting better after praying in your chapel. But this is a hospital, Grace, a place of science, of medicine. We can't have people thinking we're abandoning the practices of modern medicine in favor of, well, superstition." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Grace felt the weight of their collective doubt pressing down on her. Dr. Lisa Matthews, another board member and one of the hospital's senior physicians, leaned forward. Her voice was kinder than Whitman's, but the concern was still clear. "Grace, we understand your intentions. The chapel is a beautiful space, and we respect the role faith can play in healing. But we've had reports of families bringing their loved ones here, expecting miracles. And when those miracles don't happen, they're left devastated. We can't encourage false hope." Grace's hands tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles white, but she didn't flinch. She had seen the miracles with her own eyes. She had watched patients who were deemed beyond saving find peace, healing, and hope in that small, humble room. But how could she convey that to a room full of people who measured success by numbers, by charts, by data? Faith couldn't be quantified or proven with evidence. It was felt, experienced in the deepest part of the soul. "Please, let me explain," Grace began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "I understand that as a hospital, we rely on science and medicine to heal the sick. I am a nurse. I know better than anyone the importance of proper care. But what I've seen in the chapel, it's beyond what medicine can explain. People come there not just for physical healing, but for something deeper. They find peace, comfort, and sometimes, yes, they find miracles. I'm not asking anyone to stop practicing medicine. I'm only asking for space for faith to work alongside it." There was a pause as the members of the board exchanged glances. Whitman sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Grace, I respect your passion, but we can't afford to become a hospital known for superstition. We're barely staying afloat as it is. The city is watching us, and we need support from the state and federal levels. If word gets out that we're promoting miracles over medicine, we could lose everything. We could lose the hospital." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Grace felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down, refusing to let doubt take root in her heart. She had been called to build this chapel by Jesus himself, and despite the obstacles, she knew in her soul that this was what the hospital and the community needed. But then, a voice spoke up from the back of the room, quiet but firm. "I think we're missing something important here." Everyone turned to see Sister Agnes standing near the doorway, her habit rustling softly as she stepped forward. Though she hadn't been officially part of the board meeting, she had been listening from the hallway, her quiet presence unnoticed until now. As she approached the table, she held a stack of letters in her hands, each one neatly folded and yellowed from wear. "These," Sister Agnes said, placing the letters on the table before the board members, "are from the families of the people who have experienced the power of Grace's Chapel. They aren't just stories of miracles. They're testimonies of hope, of finding peace when they had none. Some of these people didn't receive physical healing, but they found something even more valuable: the strength to keep going. We are not just a hospital of science. We are a hospital of compassion." Whitman frowned, clearly uneasy with the direction the conversation was taking, but he didn't interrupt. Sister Agnes continued, "Faith and medicine don't have to be at odds. We've always believed that healing is a combination of the body and the spirit. The chapel doesn't undermine the work we do here. It enhances it. These families are not abandoning medical care. They're finding something more, something that medicine can't always provide. And as for the hospital's reputation," she paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, "I believe that people are beginning to see St. Mary's as a place where miracles can happen, whether through medicine or faith. That is something no amount of funding can buy." The room fell silent again, this time in contemplation. Grace stood, humbled by Sister Agnes's words, but also filled with a quiet confidence. The board members sifted through the letters, reading the heartfelt words of the families who had come to the chapel. The stories were powerful, more powerful than any statistic or report could capture. They spoke of lives touched, hearts healed, and hope restored. Finally, Dr. Matthews spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I've heard the stories too," she admitted. "I've seen the change in patients after they visit the chapel. There's something happening here. I don't know if it's a miracle or just the power of belief, but I can't deny that it's real." Whitman, still skeptical, but now more thoughtful, leaned back in his chair. "We'll need to be careful," he said finally. "We need to make sure we're not crossing any lines with this. But I think we can find a balance. If the chapel is truly bringing hope to our patients and our staff, then maybe we need to rethink what it means to be a hospital." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a step in the right direction. As the meeting adjourned and the board members filed out of the room, Grace remained for a moment, her hands still gripping the edge of the table. Sister Agnes approached her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than you realize," Sister Agnes said softly. "Faith isn't just about believing in the impossible. It's about inspiring others to believe as well." Grace nodded, her heart full of gratitude. Together, they left the boardroom, the heavy weight of doubt now replaced with a quiet sense of purpose. The chapel had withstood its first test, but Grace knew there would be more challenges ahead. Still, she believed, as she had from the beginning, that this was what God had intended for St. Mary's Hospital. The struggle for the chapel's acceptance was far from over, but it had already become something much larger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a place where faith and medicine could coexist, where hope could thrive even in the darkest of times. And that was the true miracle. Part 5, Grace's Legacy. The chapel, once a hidden corner of St. Mary's Hospital, had transformed into a radiant symbol of hope and healing. Every candle lit at the altar seemed to carry a prayer straight to heaven, and every whispered petition echoed with faith and expectation. The simple wooden cross that Grace had placed there months before was now surrounded by offerings from the community, flowers, letters of gratitude, and even drawings from children who had been healed. What had started as a humble project had grown into something far greater than Grace could have ever imagined. It was late in the evening, and the hospital was quieter than usual. Grace stood alone in the chapel, gazing at the soft flicker of candlelight that bathed the room in a warm, golden glow. The weight of the last few months had settled deeply in her bones, but as she looked around at the sanctuary she had built, a sense of peace washed over her. The chapel was no longer just a room in the basement. It had become the heart of St. Mary's. The days had blended together in a blur of patient care, chapel visits, and meetings with the hospital's board. Since that pivotal conversation with the administration, there had been cautious acceptance of the chapel's place within the hospital. The miracles that had taken place there were undeniable, and the testimonies from patients and families continued to pour in. Yet, Grace knew that not everyone was convinced, and she had learned to be at peace with that. Faith was not something that could be forced. It had to be experienced, and in this little chapel, it was. Grace knelt before the altar, her hands folded in her lap as she prayed. She had come here every night since the chapel's completion, seeking guidance, strength, and sometimes simply the comfort of God's presence. Tonight was no different, though there was a sense of finality in the air. The hospital had been saved from closure. Donations had increased significantly, not just from those who had experienced miracles, but from others who believed in the mission of St. Mary's. The hospital's financial future, once so uncertain, now looked promising. But Grace knew that her journey was far from over. She had been a vessel for God's work, but the true miracle was not in the healing of bodies. It was in the healing of hearts. She had seen it in the eyes of every person who knelt in this chapel, seeking something greater than themselves. She had seen it in Dr. Hernandez, whose skepticism had softened, and in the nurses who now joined her in prayer. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Dr. Hernandez standing at the doorway, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the candles. He looked different now, more at ease, more grounded, as if the burdens he had carried for so long had finally lifted. "Grace," he said quietly, stepping into the room, "I've been looking for you." She smiled gently, rising to meet him. "I'm always here," she replied, her voice soft but filled with warmth. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the peaceful stillness. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a moment, "for everything you've done, for the hospital, for the chapel, for the patients, and for me." Grace shook her head, humility evident in every movement. "I didn't do anything, Michael. This was God's work. I just followed his lead." Dr. Hernandez smiled faintly, but his eyes were serious. You did more than that. You gave us all hope. When things seemed darkest, you reminded us that there's something bigger than all of this. Something we can't explain, but something we can believe in. There was a long pause as the two stood together in the quiet chapel, the air thick with gratitude and understanding. Finally, Dr. Hernandez spoke again, his voice softer now. The board, they've approved the chapel as a permanent part of the hospital. It's official. This place is here to stay. Grace's heart swelled with emotion, but she remained calm, her faith steady. That's wonderful news, she said quietly. But it's not about the walls or the altar, Michael. It's about the people. This chapel is for them. Dr. Hernandez nodded. I know, and that's why it matters. For a while, neither spoke, both lost in their thoughts. The chapel had become a symbol of something much larger than St. Mary's. It was a symbol of resilience, of faith, and of the human spirit's capacity to hope even in the face of overwhelming odds. The miracles continued, though they were not always the kind that could be seen or measured. Some patients experienced physical healing, their conditions inexplicably improving after spending time in the chapel. Others found peace in their final moments, their souls comforted by the presence of something divine. Families who had been torn apart by grief found solace in prayer, their hearts mending in ways that no medicine could achieve. One afternoon, a young girl named Emily, who had been in a coma for nearly a month following a severe car accident, was brought to the chapel by her parents. They had heard the stories of healing and, though skeptical at first, were willing to try anything. Emily's prognosis had been grim, and the doctors had already told the family to prepare for the worst. As Emily's mother knelt before the altar, her tears falling onto the stone floor, she whispered a prayer of desperation. Grace stood nearby, quietly joining in the prayer, her heart aching for the family. They prayed for hours, their hands clasped together, their voices hoarse from the effort. And then, just as the last candle flickered, Emily's eyelids fluttered open. Her parents gasped, their hands flying to their mouths as they stared in disbelief. Emily, who had been unresponsive for weeks, blinked slowly and smiled weakly at her mother. It was a small movement, but it was enough to send ripples of awe through the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain it. The nurses were left speechless, but everyone knew that something extraordinary had happened. It wasn't long before Emily was walking again, her recovery nothing short of miraculous. Her story, like so many others, became a testament to the power of faith. And though some remained skeptical, the chapel continued to draw people from all over the city. Those seeking healing, those seeking peace, and those seeking a connection to something greater than themselves. Months passed, and the chapel remained a constant in the lives of those at St. Mary's. Grace, though often exhausted from the demands of her work, continued to care for the patients with the same compassion and devotion she had always shown. But now, there was a lightness in her step, a quiet joy that filled her soul. She had followed the calling placed on her heart, and though the journey had been difficult, it had been worth every moment. One evening, as Grace prepared to leave the hospital for the night, she took a final look at the chapel. The candles flickered softly, casting their gentle glow over the altar, and the room was filled with a sense of peace that was almost tangible. She smiled to herself, knowing that the work would continue long after she was gone. The chapel had become a sanctuary, not just for the patients, but for everyone who entered its doors. It was a place where faith met healing, where the impossible became possible, and where the light of hope shone brightest in the darkest of times. As Grace closed the door behind her, the echoes of prayers still lingered in the air, a reminder that the greatest miracles were often found not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of faith, in the hearts of those who dared to believe. And so, the legacy of Grace and the chapel lived on, not in the walls of St. Mary's, but in the lives of the people who had been touched by its miracles. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.